Hi, my name is Rachel Saunders, and welcome to this episode of the Lavender and Steel podcast. Today, I have got the great pleasure of introducing my friend Ashleigh Talbot, who is an amazing podcaster, and I've known Ash for about 15 years. How would you like to introduce yourself, Ash?
Podcaster works. I think so. The kind of way I would always define myself in years gone by was as like a musician, because I've been like in bands for like all of my adult life. Ever since I moved to Manchester, I joined a band and I've been in a band. But due to some medical circumstances, I'm not really able to do that anymore. I'm having trouble finding a new way of defining myself. But yeah, I do a podcast as well. So content creator, I think, is possibly a term that is used that I kind of hate, because it just sounds so like you're on a factory production line or something. Describing everything as content kind of sucks, really. You know, there's kind of a bit more to it than that. So yeah, I'm a podcaster, and I have MS, so I'm using a wheelchair. So I have an interest in disability rights, shall we say. Also, I'm trans. So if that wasn't obvious.
Well, I think that's the important bit as well. As one of the key things I want to do with Lavender and Steel was show that actually being trans is only a small part of people's lives, and actually we're much more rounded and interesting. Yeah, our lives are so much more than just the LGBTQI plus labels that other people might want to stick onto us. The fact you've lived in Manchester for so long and you've got this encyclopedic knowledge of various aspects of Manchester is just a very interesting part of who you are, because we've both been around Manchester for a long time. Yeah, you've seen the city grow, develop, change.
Yeah.
I mean, how have you seen Manchester as a centre of queer culture and queer community change over the last 20 years then?
So, I mean, in a sense, I've seen it for kind of longer than that, because when I was a nipper, a young person, I grew up in Wigan, which is part of Greater Manchester, right?
Yeah.
And so when we got to be teenagers and our parents, you know, let us go to places on day trips and go shopping at like the Trafford Centre or whatever, it was cheapest on the train to get to Manchester. So this is where we came. But also at around the same time, Queer as Folk was on, which was, of course, shot in Manchester kind of famously along Canal Street. So I had this kind of knowledge of, oh, Manchester seems gay. So when I'm older, I think I'll move to Manchester and, you know, try some stuff out. So glad I did that, because I ended up going to Preston for university. I lived for a year in North Yorkshire and went slowly mad, and then eventually just snapped like a twig and said, right, sod this. I need to wear dresses and kiss boys. I'm moving to Manchester.
Queer as folk indeed.
Queer as folk indeed. So that was 15 years ago. 16, technically. Numbers, who cares? But since then, I ended up in Manchester, living in South Manchester. When I came out and started presenting as female, that became less of a good idea. Like I was chased home and like had stuff thrown at me in the where I was living, and I was like, okay, I don't want to live here anymore. So I ended up, through a mutual friend, living in the city centre, which was tremendous. And just being so close at hand, seeing all these new buildings shoot up, right? So there used to be a skyscraper in Manchester. There's now like nearly a dozen. It's like student housing, quite a lot of it. There's a load of office buildings that have just shot up. And it's become this metropolis. Like the skyscrapers are not in the city centre, but they kind of form a ring around the city centre, like just on the very edge, because that's where everybody wants to live. So that's where all these huge new apartment buildings have shot up. And it's been quite odd to watch, because everything, or a lot of the buildings in the city centre are, you know, pretty old. Manchester, quite famously, bit of a birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. There's a lot of soot covering a lot of the older buildings. And now around them, and next to them in some cases are just all these huge, massive, blocky buildings of steel and concrete and glass. And it's just this wonderful contradiction just on the case of one street. There's a couple of places I could show you where it's like, right, well, that's from the 1700s, that's from the Industrial Revolution, and that's from last year, like right next to each other. And it's been tremendous to see. A friend of mine observed a while ago that he'd heard that you can tell how well a place is doing by the number of cranes that are present in terms of building stuff. And if that's the case, Manchester's doing very, very well, which it is. Like, there is, even if you come in on the train now, you can still see new developments, new buildings going up in different places all around the city centre. So yeah, it's really good.
How does that reshape the queer community then? Because I know the last time I was there was a lot of talk of the gentrification pushing out and marginalising queer people, especially people with lower incomes. And it's been one of those big questions of, especially with Canal Street, how they're trying to redevelop it and how they're trying to make it more upmarket and more, like the last time I was there, it didn't have the same vibe as it had 15 years ago. It felt a little bit more wine culture rather than queer culture, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I get you. Lots of sitting outside with a glass of rosé. Well, or it's in Manchester, so it's a glass of wine. But no, you are absolutely right. So this building shooting up is absolutely part of a wave of gentrification. I'm a beneficiary of that myself, just living where I live. To say that I'm not part of that would be disingenuous, because I am absolutely benefiting from the fact that there's all these new buildings. This building I'm in right now that I live in was finished in 2022, right? So that's quite recent. But you are right in terms of the way Canal Street and the areas just off around Canal Street, like there's a couple of different streets that are nearby, so like Richmond and Bloom Street, that are also part of the gay village. Now, the LGBT Foundation were in a building just on, was it Richmond or Bloom Street? On one of those streets. And it was this wonderful, old, windy building with a very slow lift in it that has various different spaces and a community library, and there was small rooms where counselling took place. So it had all of these different kind of facilities. During the pandemic, the owners of the building that the LGBT Foundation were in raised the rent extortionately, and the LGBT Foundation were forced to move out. So they're slightly outside of the gay village, but they're not able to offer the same kind of spaces, come to our building and be part of this event. They're not able to do that to the extent that they used to, because the space that they were in, they were forced out of, and they're not able to serve the community in the same way because of that. So that's just one example. There are a lot of places that, they'll open up on Canal Street. If they last more than 3 months, they're doing well. Basically, there's been a couple of closures of kind of institutions quite recently, like Number One Canal Street, which is a place that did really nice food. Velvet, which was right next to it, is also gone. I don't know what's going to be springing up there in the meantime. Napoleon's, the trans bar that I kind of grew up in my sense as a trans person. I'm sure we went there, you and I. So that's closed as well. It closed some years ago, in fact, and now appears to be like a Chinese supermarket, but the kind of Chinese supermarket where it's not even signposted in English. So I've no idea what's even in there. It's just, the village is changing, and it's just, in a sense, it's predictable because capitalism, but it's also kind of makes me a bit sad. But, and here's something that might be a little bit controversial with any other Manchester queer people that might be watching this, but I think the village needs to adapt or die, because at the moment it is dying, but it's just drinking establishments, which is great. When you're young and you go out drinking. But as you get older, you get less interested in that. I am now in a wheelchair. There are several venues along Canal Street that are not wheelchair accessible. I'm on too much medication to be able to drink alcohol. I don't have the, whatever the word is, I don't have that kind of push saying, go out drinking, because I can't do that. So I'm less interested in Canal Street as it goes along. So I want to see places like the LGBT Foundation come back into the village. places where people can hang out and not necessarily drink alcohol. I want there to be art galleries, queer spaces, another queer bookshop. There's one in Manchester just down the road from where I am at the moment. I don't know why I'm pointing in that direction. It's over there. But I think the village needs to change what it's doing, because it's just been doing the same thing for the last 30, 40 years and is slowly being eaten away by the people that own the buildings that are saying, well, we want something else in this building now, or we want to knock down the building and put flats there or whatever. And it's just going to be taken away piece by piece unless it changes, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, you see it in Nottingham. I live in Nottingham, and we lost our main gay venue about 5 years ago. It was just before lockdown. The owners closed it. However, I've noticed this with gay culture, that's become a lot more, if I say pluralistic, it's more inclusive. Like, lots of venues are queer friendly without stating they're queer friendly. And I appreciate that not every LGBTQI plus person has the same experiences, but I don't drink as well. I tend to, I'm teetotal. And it's interesting that as soon as you stop drinking, even straight cis culture, it just becomes a chore. And it's like, actually, there's not a huge amount of venues. Like, there's lots of really great coffee places, but they're all day places. We've got Cafe Sobar here in Nottingham, which is explicitly a non-alcoholic venue, but it doesn't open late into the evening. And so every venue where, if you want to go out and maybe play board games or just socialise, everything is reliant on A, having money, and B, being at least alcohol adjacent. Yeah. And it is quite frustrating, because there's a lot of things like, where have the book clubs gone? Where have the knitting circles gone? Where have the queer culture from the 80s and 90s that wasn't so alcohol dominated? That culture has slipped away, or if it exists, it's always on the periphery. I know with Manchester, I had quite a large friendship group who now dispersed, and they had lots of different activities going on, like book clubs and just general meeting up and doing things. And it just feels like, while plenty of the older queer community maybe still do those things, there are fewer spaces for younger queer people to be able to engage in those activities. And it's interesting that a lot of that seems to have gone online. So there's lots of queer podcasters, some amazing YouTubers and TikTokers and Instagrammers who are exposing the younger generation to amazing queer culture. But when it comes to interacting in real life, a lot of those online spaces don't seem to have transposed themselves into real life.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think I'm perhaps less plugged into online culture as I might be. I'm not a heavy user of Instagram. I'm not on TikTok. It's on the podcast that I do, What the Trans, I got some younger people involved, and they deal with it. So, like, in terms of keeping an eye on like TikTok trends and making short videos, we do have a couple of people, like literally a small team of people who put stuff together in terms of like animations or short videos from this Pride or this event. So while the podcast as an institution is staying involved and trying to engage in that side of queer culture, I'm not myself in charge of that. And I think, like, trying to kind of barge into TikTok and say, hello, young people, how do you do, fellow kids? Like,
yeah.
It doesn't feel like it would be appropriate of me to try and get involved in that aspect, simply because sometimes you've just got to admit you're too old. And that's where I'm at. I turn 42 later this year. And so while that is life, the universe and everything, it's not like an age where you can just sort of still go out and convince yourself you're still cool. I'm still with it.
Yeah. No, I felt that because I turned 44 this year, and it's interesting how I still feel young at heart. I still don't feel like I'm in my 40s, but yet at the same time, because I lecture at University of Nottingham, and having just completed a PhD where I was around students for 9 years, there's not just an age gap, but there's a culture gap that's virtually impossible to cross. And it's not a bad thing, especially when it comes to LGBTQI plus issues. It's like a lot of the younger generation, the issues that we faced when we were growing up, some of that is still there, but a lot of it is, they're very pluralistic in terms of queer identities. I don't think a lot of, especially first and second year students, might necessarily want to put a LGBTQI plus label on themselves. They might just see it as part of who they are rather than having to come out. They just exist. And it's interesting how the dynamic has shifted from being one of coming out culture to being one of we exist culture, therefore we don't need to just fully be exuberant about it. I know that's different for trans people, and I know a lot of younger trans people are being a lot more dynamic with their identities because they feel like being oppressed, which is slightly ironic because as somebody who came out in 2000 who has tried to be discreet with my identity, and so much I didn't feel up until about 2020 I didn't feel the need to express it so blatantly. But now, as the UK government and the American government are starting to tighten the reins on being trans, it's like actually I feel like I need to be more expressive of it and actually embrace that identity in a way that I didn't when I was younger.
Yeah, and it's funny that the fact that that's happening is what's making me kind of go, well, I don't have to comply with this. Fuck you, make me. But simply as a mode of rebellion, right? Of saying, no, you do not get to tell me who I am and how I can live my life. Even just over the course of the last sort of 15 years in Manchester, when I moved here, I was still presenting as male and met somebody at Pride who remains a friend to this day. But we met at Pride, and so initially we were together and we were boyfriends. Then we split up, both started to transition and dated again as girlfriends. But as on both times, we didn't feel safe holding hands with each other anywhere apart from in the village, along Canal Street and whatever else. But now, as I go out to the city and go get my prescriptions and, go to a bookshop or whatever, I see more and more queer couples just holding hands, just existing. We exist, right? And that's fucking fabulous. And I always kind of just, it makes me smile every time I see it. It's just a little thing. And I'm sure, some of them think I'm being creepy, but I'm not. I'm just like, oh, that's really nice. We have moved on. The city I live in has moved on, because 10 years ago, if you were holding hands as a queer couple, you might have expected a problem. Sad to say, but that doesn't seem to be the case anymore, and that's wonderful. It really is, I think.
And it's interesting when you've got a place like Bloomsbury, which embrace that queer culture and that queer identity. Like, you've got Gays the Word, you've got trans pride and pride flags painted onto the zebra crossings, and it's really interesting how it's, on one hand, as I say, I feel queerness is becoming more ingrained and embedded, but on the other hand, there's that rebellious streak, and it goes back to obviously the first Pride was a riot, and I think that is starting to come back again, that pushback on the normalization of cisgender identities, where people are saying, well, actually, you can only exist in a cisgender heteronormative way, when actually being queer, being trans, being any part of the LGBTQI plus spectrum, it's just simply existing as a form of rebellion when everyone treats your identity as a problem in need of a cisnormative solution.
Yeah, agreed. And if someone's viewing someone's identity, someone's existence as a problem, that implies that they might be looking for a solution to that problem. And you see what I'm doing there. I don't need to take it any further. That's probably me very much overstating it. But sometimes it really doesn't feel like it. Sometimes it feels like, and particularly with what's taking place in America, it feels like everything's being locked down. People's passports are being taken away or forcibly changed or destroyed. And you are not able to then leave the country. You're then stuck, and then whatever the hell else comes down the line subsequent to that, you have no choice but to endure, right? Unless you sneak out of the country in some way, whatever. But there has been at least one, I'm sorry to invoke the word, but there has been at least one genocide monitoring project who have said that the stuff that's happening in America and in the UK while not being explicitly genocidal, is very similar to the precursors of it. Like, we've seen this happen before historically, and then the next thing that happens is something really, really, really bad. And I don't know what to do with that information. I'm part of the community that this stuff is aimed at. I don't feel like I want to run away, but I'm cognizant of the idea that I might have to. And that's so weird, right? I
know that. Yeah, I agree completely. And it's like you look at something like what Lemkin Institute said about the genocide, and it's I am a big scholar of Hannah Arendt's work. She has many issues in terms of some of her output, but however, one of the things she was very clear on is that radicalized groups retain their power. So if you're an outside group and a marginalized group, you retain your power by being radical, and the moment you try to assimilate, you start to lose political power. And I think with trans and LGBTQ plus people more broadly, there's been a big push for assimilation, big push to pass, however that might look.
Yeah.
And in the process, you start to lose that political edge because you don't see the need to be political. One of the illuminating things for me since 2020, since gender critics started their push, is that we as a society have accepted that gender critical beliefs are more valid than somebody's held identity. And if it had been any other religious group, philosophical group, who've been pushing and promoting these views, even if they were Christian, Jew, Muslim, etc., you wouldn't have seen the same embracing as you have by mainstream politicians and by newspapers. If it had been a religious group who were doing it, they would have just been treated like any other group. And Christians for a long time, and to agree, some Muslim groups have been doing this for a long time. But it was only after my forced Tasha's court case where she managed to get a court to accept that being gender critical was a philosophical belief. You then saw the governments and then the UK Supreme Court say, well, actually, because those beliefs are valid, therefore the fears those believers have are equally valid, and therefore we need to segregate society based on those fears. And if it had been any other religious group, if it had been any other philosophical group, that I doubt that would have happened.
Agreed. So Maya forced after the ruling that was, that said, oh, actually, yeah, gender critical beliefs, totally valid. That was an appeal to a judgment that was made before that. So this initial first judgment described gender critical beliefs as not worthy of respect in a democratic society. We should have stuck with that. That's where it should be, but it's not. Apparently, it's valid and it's protected by the Equality Act, although there's a certain amount of legal scholarship that suggests, or at least asks the question, is it though? But that's not for me to decide. That's for a bunch of people who, get paid a lot of money and wear wigs while they're at work to decide.
So we're not talking about drag queens here?
No, sadly not. I'm not sure drag queens get paid a lot of money, to be honest. Barristers do, sadly. The guy from the Supreme Court, Ben Cooper, KC, who apparently gave needed structure and focus to the argument, according to the Supreme Court, when they made their ruling last year. The one. Yeah, I'm sure it's Ben Cooper. And I just remembered his existence as a barrister. And I was
Because I think one of the things that the Four Women Scotland decision from April 2025 shocked me was how they framed lesbian, and how, for the first time in English legal history, lesbian has a legal definition. Because
indeed,
up until last year, same with sex, because while you had Corbett v. Corbett in 1970, which gave a list of markers for sex, biological sex and lesbian have never had a primary legislation or even a Supreme Court case law defining what they are. And under my scholarship, I'm writing a paper in response to Michael Foran's paper. Michael Foran was quoted by the UK Supreme Court in the Four Women Scotland ruling. And one of the things that people don't realise and the media hasn't picked up on is no one's gone back and read his original paper. And in the original paper, he confuses so many things. He takes what's called a natural law perspective on rights and on how we should exist in society, which basically says that if it's happened in the past, it's good enough for society. And essentially, the Supreme Court used the term the ordinary meaning of sex, what the ordinary person would think sex means. So if you read through the ruling, there are actually 3 different definitions, and only one of those definitions gets ever brought up in the media, as in what was described at birth on a birth certificate. But there are 2 other meanings in the ruling. And so when trans people say that the ruling is incoherent and how can you apply it, it was a ruling that is going to impact everybody: cisgender, transgender, non-binary, genderqueer, however you wish to present yourself. If the ruling is applied as gender critics intend, it's going to disrupt everybody's life. And it goes back to this idea of activism. It goes back to this idea of gentrification. It goes back to this idea of segregation. It's like, how do we as a society want to exist? And if we're going to segregate people out of it, there needs to be a significant pushback against that.
Like, agreed. And I think one of the aspects that could and should be pushed back on is this notion that has been put about by For Women Scotland, by Maya Forstater and Sex Matters and all the other people, that this one ruling has now brought legal clarity when it has very much done the opposite, right? And how can it possibly have brought clarity to something where it says, oh, well, trans people should not use the toilet that they present, they should use the toilet of their biological sex, except a trans man who's kind of far enough down the line, who's got like more masculine features like beard and whatever else, who might not be able to use any toilet. That's not clarity, lads. Like, are you absolutely sure that's what you've done, or have you just opened the door for people to stop any mask of center-looking woman from entering the toilet and getting kind of stopped from doing so because they've got shorter hair or they're wearing trousers or whatever? This is just kind of enforcing 19th century gender roles by saying, no, well, if you don't want to get stopped, you have to be this, this, and this, and wear this, this, and this. So just that ruling was infuriating.
And it's complicated as well, because obviously as a disabled woman, you have to access certain disabled spaces.
Yep.
And those disabled spaces are now trans people are being told to use those disabled spaces, which takes away from disabled people's ability to move through the world.
Indeed. Now, I don't want to put trans people and disabled people in opposition to each other. The government are happy to do that by saying, oh, well, trans people need to use the disabled toilets to use any gender-neutral spaces. And that, to me, has just seemed like disability last, right? So this thing that I encounter so often when I went to a venue last night, right? And it was clear that the very last thing the people that owned this venue had thought about was, oh, well, what if someone in a wheelchair comes into our venue, right? So, and there have been a couple of other places that I've been to just this week where it was obvious that the last thing that had been thought about was, oh, well, and just in case we get somebody in a wheelchair, we'll just say this toilet here down the end of a long corridor that's really narrow, that you can't really turn your wheelchair around into. That's where the disabled toilet is, right? Even though it's kind of not accessible to get there for a lot of disabled people. So for the government to assume that it's kind of safe and a good idea for trans people to use the disabled spaces, when disabled spaces are already kind of lacking and poorly thought out and whatever, is just making life difficult for trans people and for disabled people. And like, I'm both, so they got me coming and going, right? So I can see this from both ends, and I get it, but it doesn't make me annoyed at trans people using the disabled toilet. It doesn't make me annoyed at anybody who needs to use that facility. It makes me annoyed at For Women Scotland and at the Supreme Court and at the government, who have made these decisions based on a ruling that's just muddied the waters, right? So, yeah, it can be a bit frustrating that it's been declared, oh, well, trans people should use the disabled toilets, when disabled toilets are already kind of in short supply, or it feels like. And some disabled toilets at some venues, like at the Victoria Warehouse in Manchester, the disabled toilet is inside the gendered bit of the toilet. So you can go to the women's disabled toilet or the men's disabled toilet. And there are some places where that's kind of creeping in a little bit more, or places that are big enough to have more than one disabled toilet anyway.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that some of the venues I've seen now have decided to just go gender neutral with everything and just get rid of gendered spaces. Which, I mean, if we're wanting a pluralistic world, it's the exact opposite of what For Women Scotland were intending. Most businesses can't afford or don't have the space to put in segregated toilets, and most customers don't really care. Mm-hmm. And I think it comes back down to that fear question. It's like, how do we as a society want to address the fears of a select few? Do we want to segregate society out because of that? And I think this is, as the older I get, the more I feel that pluralism has got to push back against fear. And yes, you might have personal fears against certain things. You might have certain issues with certain groups, but that doesn't mean that those groups cannot exist in society. You can't just simply deny somebody or a group of use of a space just because you fear that group's presence, or you've been taught to fear that group's presence.
I'm not sure it's fear, you know. I think it's revulsion. It's not, you know, it's just ick, right? It's some upper middle class women with too much money that they've been provided, you know, they've been given too much money by people like the ADF and the Heritage Foundation in the US. You know, that's where a lot of the funding for this comes from. And because of their ick, we now have the For Women Scotland, and we now have that Maya Forstater appeal review where gender critical views are protected under the Equality Act, even though they're not mentioned in the Act. Well, you know, let's put that aside. So to say it's fear is kind of a step too far. It's like people saying homophobia. Oh, it's a genuine fear of gay people. It's not. It's a hatred of gay people. So I would just, I would push back slightly against the idea of it being a fear.
I take on board the point about it being revulsion. That actually is a better word for it, because you look at people like Kathleen Stock and Julie Bindel and she who will not be named. The fact we have to go, she will not be named. She cannot be named. It's like it's got to this ridiculous stage where you can list off a group of about 15 women, and there's one or two men in that group, but it's all middle class, majority of white people, though people like
Akira Rindorf,
but it's the vast majority of the middle class white women, some of whom have got university degrees, some of whom have had successful careers like Julie Bindel and J.K. Rowling, but they've always had this edge to them in the background, like Julie Bindel, Julie Burchill, etc. They took Janice Raymond's ideas. Janice Raymond wrote a book in the 1970s called The Transsexual Empire, and she herself was an ex-Catholic nun who drew upon Catholic dogma to conceive of the idea that transsexual women were a plague on lesbian culture. And you just have to read Janice Raymond's book to see where a lot of the ideas come from now. Yeah. Plus, if you look back at the 1960s and 70s in Spain with the idea of gender ideology, it's not a recent invention, it's an invention of the Catholic Church, and I think people forget this. But all of the ideas that are now coming to the fore in politics, they've been around for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, and they're getting the time in the sun because reactionary right-wing politics needs another group of scapegoats. You've had immigrants, you've had Muslims, and now trans people. You've had single mothers, you've had women who've had abortions, you've had the wrong type of Christians, you've had Jews, you've had the wrong type of Muslims. You've had a whole range of groups of people who have been explicitly targeted because it's been politically convenient to do it. And yet, with trans people, we are the only group who are explicitly denied access to society because of a court ruling and because of the way the courts are being used. No other minority group in the 21st century has faced the same level of social exclusion through the courts and through legislation that trans people have.
I mean, indeed. And I'm aware of the Transsexual Empire. I know that Janice Raymond kind of wrote that. There's just one point which is a little bit in the weeds, but someone recently pointed out that Kathleen Stock is the Waluigi of Judith Butler. And, I saw a picture of the two of them and I thought, oh, God, yeah, Kathleen Stock is just evil Judith Butler. But someone described it as the Waluigi and now I can't get that image out of my head. So, yes, I'm aware of the Transsexual Empire. I haven't read it. I was not aware that a lot of it came from Catholic dogma, but that does not surprise me. because, how would it? Because it is all so regressive, and they think, oh, well, we're the new politics. People think of it as a reactionary movement. It's not that reactionary. It has kind of always been there. It's always existed, from the initial TERFy movements, who legitimately did call themselves trans, including radical feminists, and believed that they were feminists. Although, again, there's an argument there for saying, are you though?
Yeah. It's why I call them gender critical believers rather than TERF, because TERF has a certain connotation where you accept their feminism, whereas gender critics, you don't include it in the feminist tree.
I mean, on the podcast, we just tend to call them anti-trans, because they're anti-trans agitators. And so I've brought up the Heritage Foundation and the ADF, the Alliance Defending Freedom, both American organizations, both hard right, evangelical Christian groups who have a lot of money provided to them by certain flavors of extremely wealthy person who give money to the ADF and the Heritage Foundation. But it doesn't stop with trans rights, right? So the Heritage Foundation have started saying, oh, well, we can open up a door into Britain and start influencing their culture. But they have started with trans rights by saying, okay, well, we'll give money for a court case so trans people aren't allowed to go to the toilet anymore, blah, blah, blah. But it won't finish with us, right? We aren't the next target. There will always be a next target. And the next targets are going to be abortion rights, same-sex marriage, and all these other aspects of LGBTQ and indeed women's rights that are now attempts are going to be made to erode those because trans people are kind of seen as defeated. And I remember kind of witnessing one exchange between gender critical activists where they were expressing surprise and dismay that trans people hadn't just given up in the wake of the Supreme Court ruling. They were like, well, but they're supposed to stop. They lost. Why don't they just shut up and go away? It's like, well, it's not how it works, actually. Funnily enough, if someone tries to take your rights away, you don't just let them. Like there's always going to be a next target. And so I'm amazed that people like Maya Forstater, Alison Bailey, various other people who just genuinely seem to perceive themselves as standing up for women's rights, how they don't see that the places they're accepting the funding for will take their rights away as quick as you like, should they get the opportunity to do so. And it's just, we can see it. And it's so obvious from the outside. Why can't they see it, right? Why aren't they paying attention to the people that are allowing them to do what they're doing? But I get, because they're saying, oh, yeah, absolutely, we'll give you all the money in the world to fight against trans people, they're not looking a gift horse in the mouth, and they should, because they're next.
It's very telling that Baroness Faulkner, the ex-head of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, is now coming for abortion rights.
Yep.
And it's just like, you look at the track record of all of these women. You look at Kathleen Stock, who went, after she left Sussex, after she resigned from being in Sussex, she wasn't fired, she resigned. She went and worked in America, which was a right-wing private university. And it's really interesting how a lot of, like Julie Bindel has gone and written for The Times, The Telegraph, The Sun, all of the right-wing papers. And I wrote a piece on her last year. It was very telling that people on X who saw the thread said, oh, she should sue you for defamation. I cited every single source in the article based on her own writing. And she just laughed it off. She said, oh, it's nothing. But you look at what she'd actually written and who she'd supported. She backed Donald Trump. Julie Bindel is one of the arch gender critics. She's one of those people who's been campaigning for 30 years on this issue. And she backed Donald Trump because he was gender critical. And people were saying, and I've seen people responding saying, oh, but she only supported him because he's going to push back on trans people. And I said, you can't cherry pick. It's the same with reform in the UK. As bad as Labour is, and I really don't like the current Labour government because of their stance on trans rights and immigration and a few other issues, if reform come in, LGBTQI plus people, immigrants, abortion, all of the rights that we hold to be sacrosanct are going to be set aside. You're going to see the UK government is currently threatening to pull out of the European Convention on Human Rights over immigration. And it's like, if we do that, workers' rights are going to be under threat. So our basic ability to have a 7.5-hour work day, have holidays, all of those other rights that we take for granted are under threat, in part because gender critical people are being used as you said, as a door to open these other things.
Yeah. And I think the current battleground, and as will be highlighted on the episode of my podcast that we're about to release, which is about sports. One of the things that is a key plank of the entire thing is that the Heritage Foundation and the ADF have spotted a thing, because I mentioned to you before we started recording, we did a poll on our Discord saying, we've got these individual issues: healthcare for trans people, bodily autonomy, trans sports, like a list of things. Give these things a ranking for what you think is the most important thing. And the most important thing was trans healthcare and medicine for young people, followed immediately by the same for adults, and various other things. Dead last at the very bottom was sports. So we didn't want to kind of do a thing about transports that the audience didn't want. So we've tried to frame it sort of slightly differently, because one of our findings is that the places in America, Heritage, ADF, also have picked up on the fact, well, trans people don't care about sports. That's an open door. That's a crack in the wall, right, in the defensive wall. So they think if they can get their horrible evangelical crowbar in there and dump some money into somebody who wants to try and take all these sporting associations to court and say this person shouldn't be allowed to play, trans people shouldn't be allowed to play this thing. So yeah, we suspect that's going to be a battleground. It already is. There are lots of sporting organizations that have said no more trans people, including chess. Okay, because trans people have such a big, massive, trans women being sort of so much bigger and stronger and stuff is such an advantage when you're playing chess. But the same for like pool and darts and various other organizations for these sports where you think, well, that's not going to make the slightest bit of difference if a trans person's physique is one way or another. But apparently they've decided, no, we hate trans people. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I've seen this because I play women's hockey, and I still play women's hockey. I refuse to play men's stroke open category. Last year, England Hockey brought in a change last January that, effective as of last September, trans women couldn't play the sport. As soon as the rules came down in January, I initiated contact with solicitors. We were going to run a claim, and then For Women Scotland happened, and solicitors put the brake on the claim. And what was really telling, I have been playing women's hockey since 2000. I was probably the first out trans woman in hockey as a sport. And it's very telling, in the entire 25 years I was playing, not a single person had a problem.
Yeah.
And when you look back at the evidence of these bans, you have a geneticist called Emma Hilton, who comes up time and time again.
Yeah.
And if you read through her actual work, methodologically, it's flawed. The systematic review that she carried out on literature regarding cis and trans athletes doesn't hold up to scrutiny because you can't replicate it. And yet you have organisations like the IOC and England Hockey and other international sports organisations depending on it to justify their bans. And going back to your point about money, trans people and trans allies have very little capital to be able to invest in research.
Yeah.
There's very little money there funding opportunities. And within academia, if you're a trans person wanting to look at trans issues, you have to do it through gender studies, or you have to be very niche about it. There's very little scope to be able to look at it holistically. And I think part of the reason for doing this podcast is that there is room for the trans community and trans allies to actually scope out research and activism and think tanks and policy that we could fund as a community and as a group, that can fund your podcast, can fund other podcasts that are dealing with these issues, that actually push back in a way that has impact, and you can have effective policy that is showing the inherent problems and flaws that gender critics and far-right extremists are putting forward, that you don't just have to point to people like Arendt and Foucault, etc., that actually there is tangible lives at stake here. That you see this as a musician, you spent a long period of your life playing music on the stage, and you saw the diversity of culture of your audiences, your crowds, your bandmates and the people you play with. And now it's like, actually, do we want to lose that texture of society? Do we want to lose the plurality that makes British society and American society and French and German, etc. society so strong in favour of just isolating and marginalising groups who are no longer worthy of support in a democratic society, to shift my thought status falling around. Because if gender critical beliefs are reasonable, that means that being trans on some level has got to be unreasonable. And I think that for me is the biggest issue that we're facing, is like being trans has never been a problem until gender critics make it a problem.
Yeah, no, agreed. And just to sort of pick up on your point about being in bands, one of the events that I've had the good fortune to play at, it's called Infest, and it used to be held at Bradford University during the summer. So there would be like empty halls, buildings, and various other things. So you could pay to get a ticket to stay in the student halls, and so you'd just be on this relatively small campus at Bradford University for the entire event. So I didn't do that when I stayed there, when I played a gig there, but the diversity of the people, yes, it was a goth gig, and I think goth culture and punk culture and different kind of alternate music-based subcultures have always been a playground for gender expression for trans people. I think one of the gender criticals some years ago now picked up on this and said that, well, previously all the men in goth culture who just played with lipstick, they're all trans now. It's like, I think you might be oversimplifying something there, darling. So, but just at that event, the kind of massive diversity of people that were there in terms of gender presentation. And it's like, well, which toilets do these people use, and does it matter, right? Because there were people there who had very extremely precisely done beards, but they were otherwise completely femmed up to the nines and were using the women's toilet, and it wasn't a fucking problem because this was 2019 and things were better back then, you know.
Yes, I agree. And I think this is a good note to end on, actually, that while I'm very reluctant to say that the past was a golden age, because there was plenty wrong with the past, actually, yes, the way things have regressed post-COVID has been shocking to see. And that if we want to keep the pluralistic society that we value, we've got to keep pushing back against this, because it's not just one or two people, it's hundreds of thousands of people who are being impacted, tens of thousands being impacted. And that trans people are a flock of canaries, and they're singing, and we need to listen.
Yeah, exactly. 100%. Because it's not just us. You know, we are the current target. There will be a next target. There will always be a next target.
Yep.
So,
have you got anything you'd like to add before we close out?
I'm a member of the Green Party, and if you're sick of this politics of fear by people like Nigel Farage and Reform and whatever the split off from Reform is, Resolve or whatever. If you're tired of the politics of hatred and you have got some room in your heart for hope, I would recommend getting involved with your local Green Party, meet some new people, and let's build the future together.
Epic. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure, Ash, as always.
Yes, you too.
Good luck with the podcast, and good luck with everything going forward. And
you too. No problem.